Hello everyone, I am Mahammad Mammadov, a research fellow at the Topchubashov Center. Today we continue our TopTalk video series on geopolitical developments in the wider Eurasian region, and in this episode we will discuss the factor of uncertainty emanating from the wars in Ukraine and Israel-Hamas war and their implications for the so-called rules-based international order. My guest is Mr. Stefan Wolff. Mr. Wolff is a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham. So first of all, Professor Wolff, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining our program. I would like to start with Ukraine. These days we have been observing some remarkable developments on the battlefield in Ukraine, in the southern and eastern fronts. Today, President Zelensky said there are ongoing battles in Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Liman, Kupiansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And we also see growing uncertainties around the external help, whether economic or military, Ukraine is receiving from its Western partners. In this context, some people argue that Ukraine should sit to a negotiation table with Russia in a ceasefire agreement, or some people argue that the situation will evolve into a kind of stalemate that will probably last for years. And there are also arguments that Russia or Ukraine will eventually win this war. So my question is, how would you evaluate the proximate future of the Russia-Ukraine war, or let's say Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. I think the honor and pleasure are all mine. I think in terms of the near future of the conflict, I think what we will see is a continuing stalemate with relatively little progress by either side on the what is now a more than 1,000-kilometer long front line. You have mentioned some of the hotspots of the fighting, and I think that will probably continue. I do think that it is more likely than not that Russia might be able to capture Avdiivka before the winter. But I really don't think that there will be any major breakthrough by either side. I mean, Ukraine has mounted its current counteroffensive for almost 6 months now. I mean, it started in late May, early June. And the gains really have been relatively small, certainly compared to what happened last year. And I think that was mostly a result of the very well prepared Russian defenses. And what I expect to happen over the next 6 months is that both sides are likely to invest more into their own defenses. Obviously, Ukraine will be much more exposed again during the winter to Russian attacks on critical infrastructure. So I'm almost certain that it will be yet another tough winter for Ukraine. But I think by the time we come to spring, it will be even more difficult for either side to make a major breakthrough on the battlefield, simply because defenses will have been hardened, will have become more deeply entrenched. And as you alluded to in your opening remarks, I also don't see that either side will really gain a major advantage on the basis of more supplies from their respective allies. So it's a question how far the West will be able to commit to more supplies for Ukraine, especially with elections coming up in the United States next year, where this will be an issue. Congress is already paralyzed over foreign aid, including to Ukraine. We have seen problems in the EU budget process with Hungary and Slovakia raising objections, at least at this stage. But it's not very different on the Russian side either. I mean, neither, I think, North Korea nor Iran can give Russia a major advantage on the battlefield. And from what it looks like at the moment, to me at least, it's unlikely that China will commit massively to supporting a Russian victory in Ukraine.
Yeah, I'll ask a related question, I think, which is Many people in this part of the world are interested always because always talking about, let's say, Ukraine war in the context of broader Russia-West relations. We wonder if we can see some sort of, not reset, but some sort of, let's say, calming of relations between Russia and the West, whether it's in the context of balancing China or something. Because right now these small countries are arranging their foreign policy according to this fracture between the US and Russia. But there are still questions that, because we have seen this after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. Yes, it's obvious that this time it's something different, but do you see any small, even prospects of some kind of, in the end, it's realpolitik, and maybe, I mean, how can we see the scenario?
I think that's a really interesting point that you are making there. And I think for much of the period until 2022, there was, I think, quite a strong school of thought in sort of Western diplomatic circles that saw it as potentially more advantageous to mend relations with Russia and make sure that sort of there is not the kind of Russia-China alliance that has now emerged in the context of Russia's invasion in Ukraine in 2022. Now, I think that needs to be qualified in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, Russia and China have grown more closely together ideologically, I would say, certainly over the last 10 or so years, and certainly with the beginning of President Xi's presidency in China. So I think there's quite a close relationship between Xi and Putin personally. Now that said, on the other hand, I do think now that certainly the thinking in most Western capitals is that, yes, China is sort of in the long term the most likely peer competitor of the United States and the West more generally. But I would also argue that at the moment we do see a number of signs where both sides realize that they are in competition, that they are probably rivals, but also both sides do have an interest in, I would say, restabilizing relations. There have been a number of quite interesting meetings over the past month in the run-up to what is now likely to happen tomorrow, which is the second face-to-face meeting between Presidents Xi and Biden. And I think here there's a real opportunity for both sides to commit to, let's say, minimum rules of engagement, not least because I think the fact that we have, beyond the war in Ukraine, there are several other quite urgent issues. There's the war in the Middle East. There are a lot of other crises, conflicts that basically just fly under the radar. If you look at the violence in Sudan, that has been massively increasing as well. If you look at continuing tensions between Serbia and Kosovo in the Western Balkans, if you look at the refugee crisis between Afghanistan and Pakistan at the moment, I think all of that has created, I would hope, a sense of urgency that makes the key players in Washington and Beijing realize that they need to have functioning communication channels, that they can manage these tensions and make sure that, for example, we do not have a regional escalation of the current war between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah, Professor, the European Commission recently recommended opening its session negotiations with Ukraine, but we know that there are some concerns both in the context of the EU's absorption capacity, and some big EU member states have some reservations about these countries joining the EU, and on the Ukraine side that there are questions if Ukraine is really ready for joining the EU. So in this context, how do you see the prospects of Ukraine's membership in the EU?
Not very good in the short term. Let's put it like that. And I think that really is. I mean, all the issues that you raised are 100% valid. So there are concerns within the EU. There's a question of absorption capacity. There's a question of preparedness of Ukraine. I think at the moment the key issue, very obviously, is the war, and it is extremely difficult to sort of see how a very complex, very costly also accession process can actually be managed under conditions of the kind of war that Ukraine has experienced now for almost 2 years. So I think that is the most immediate issue that will make it very difficult to make any reasonable, meaningful progress in the accession negotiations. So really, when we are discussing EU accession for Ukraine, this is going to be a long-term process. Even sort of, I mean, past accession processes, say, whatever we had in the 1980s and the 1990s and then in the 2000s, I mean, they have taken years, even with countries that were far more advanced, that were far more integrated already with the European Union, had adjusted their legal frameworks for many, many years. So I think in that sense, once the war is over and Ukraine can really think seriously about recovery, and as part of this recovery process, the process of EU accession, I think then a lot of these issues will come up again about absorption capacity, about the level of preparedness of Ukraine. And then we will see the real challenges beyond the hopefully short-term issue of the continuing war. And I think that will then, in my view, probably require another 10 years of really careful preparations on both sides to enable what will be, in terms of simply the size of the country, the largest accession that the EU will have seen, certainly since the accession of Great Britain in 1973.
Yeah. So about Israel-Hamas war, everyone now talks about it and its implications, and I think you would agree with me that one of the most famous argument now is that it is being considered as the last nail in the coffin of, let's say, so-called rules-based international order. Some people say that the Western reaction, which is considered mostly biased, yeah, and that awakens the Western and American credibility and etc. And I'll use one quote which I saw last time Mr. Stefan Wolff, famous realist scholar, used in his article in Foreign Policy. He says, one senior G7 diplomat says, "We have definitely lost the battle in the global south. All the work we have done with the global south over Ukraine has been lost. Forget about rules, forget about world order. They won't ever listen to us again." So it's really interesting. How do you think this this Western reaction will affect its, I mean, in terms of support, the geopolitical competition with Russia and China and Eastern Europe and South China Sea, respectively?
I think it's a very interesting and very complicated question. I do think there's certainly something to be said about the fact that the initial reaction, not in the sense of the reaction to the attacks carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October, but the initial reaction to the Israeli response certainly was viewed very critically in the global south. Now we also, I think, have to acknowledge that this is still very much an ongoing and quite fluid process. So what we have seen over the last couple of days is now increasing pressure, including public pressure, including from the United States, from France, and other Western capitals on Israel. And I think in a way what we are seeing here now is not necessarily a recalibration of the Western position, but rather an adjustment to the fact that, exactly as you said, potentially what is at stake here is the rules-based international order. And I think there is a realization now that at some point we have to decide whether we are in favor of observance of international humanitarian law or not. We can't pick and choose
Yes.
the cases where we are in favor and where we are not in favor. And I think this realization is now dawning more clearly on Western leaders. And I think that is reflected in statements like the one that you had from President Macron over the weekend. So I wouldn't be quite as pessimistic and say, well, this is it now, and rules-based order is gone, forget the global south, we have lost the battle there. I also think it's more complicated in the global south itself. So for example, if you look at the positions of a number of the Arab countries, I mean, yes, they want sort of the rights of Palestinians in Gaza respected, but they certainly do not want to see a solution at the end of this war that in any way involves Hamas. I mean, most of them have been critical, if not outright, and many of them have been fearful of what Hamas has actually been doing. There are a lot of questions about, for example, the Saudi-Iran relationship and Iran's support for Hamas, for other militant groups in the Middle East. So a lot of that is not necessary, where you don't have sort of a clear-cut line between sort of Israel and its partners in the West and the rest of the world. And I think the same goes for Russia and China. I mean, for Russia right now, everything that disrupts and can be used to distract, can be used to further its own propaganda, is obviously welcome. I think for China, it's slightly different because China generally, in my view, is still more interested in stability and in a gradual sort of evolution of the global order. That absolutely, it does not want it to continue as a US-based, US-centric, US-dominated order. But I think China would like to see a much more gradual transition away from this order than certainly Russia would want. On top of that, China is significantly dependent on oil and gas imports from the region, especially from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So any instability in the region, any potential threat to that is also very difficult for China, given the, let's say, complicated economic recovery that is still undergoing in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. So I think a lot of these issues are still in flux, and I'm always a bit more of an optimist, and I think that well, in the end, some kind of reason and rationality will prevail. And I think that brings me back to the earlier point that we discussed there. I think it's really important that the United States and China and the West more generally find a way in which they can re-stabilize the international system, establish the kind of communication channels that will allow them to contain and manage and hopefully resolve crises like the ones that we currently experience in the Middle East.
Interesting. It's also interesting for me how you see the place of, let's say, small powers in this kind of a world where uncertainty, let's say, is the most potent geostrategic dynamic. Why it is interesting for me mostly is, I don't know if you agree with me, there's a weird situation that in some regions, even in this growing uncertainty, some small powers are behaving quite in an ambitious way. I mean, maybe you can add here Azerbaijan or Qatar, or I don't know, some even Armenia. And I mean, there is this growing uncertainty, but these small countries are taking some, bold moves. But at the same time, there are arguments that this kind of uncertainty, this kind of, let's say, anarchy, can have serious repercussions for the let's say, existence or survival, let's say, of these countries as an independent actors in this, let's say, fracturing world order. So how do you see their place in this system?
I think you have put it very well. I mean, uncertainty is always an opportunity and a challenge for small powers, and I would say middle powers even more so, because they clearly benefit from a certain degree of rivalry between the great powers. I mean, countries in the South Caucasus, in Central Asia, have described that for many years as their multi-vector foreign policy. So be friendly with most, not an enemy of anybody, and sort of explore the different opportunities that come from the fact that different great powers, if you want, seek influence in particular regions. And I think it's particularly interesting if we consider Central Asia here at the moment, where I think it's an amazing flurry of high-profile meetings. Depending on where you want to start the cycle, I mean, the China Central Asia Summit in the spring, the C5+1 meeting of the presidents of the United States and the Central Asian countries in September this year. High-profile visits. President Putin visited Kazakhstan only a couple of days ago. So I think from that perspective, you can see sort of, on the one hand, the opportunities that this current state of, I think, transition in the international order brings for smaller powers and middle powers. So in a sense, it gives them an opportunity to carve out their own spaces. And you mentioned Qatar there. I would, to some extent, add United Arab Emirates, maybe Saudi Arabia, certainly Turkey, as countries that have not only just pursued their own interests, but also actually have offered their good offices in various mediation initiatives. So if you look at Turkey, for example, and the Black Sea grain mechanism that was negotiated for the first time in July last year, and then renewed a couple of times, and now if you're optimistic, you can say it's suspended and maybe will be revived. But I mean, that's obviously something that serves Turkey itself, but it's also something that has sort of a broader benefit as a global public good, if you want it. So I think from that perspective, uncertainty creates this space in which smaller and middle powers can become more proactive in their own foreign policies. On the other hand, if relations between the great powers, and these are in a way Russia, China, and the global West, if they don't restabilize in some way, then that will also make it more difficult for those smaller players. Because in the end, if we have more fragmentation in the international system, whether that is from a geopolitical or geoeconomic perspective, in the end, these smaller powers will have to take sides. So they won't be able forever to play 2 sides or 3 sides. So I think from that perspective, there is again sort of a period now where we could see a positive rebalancing of international relations. So if you want a positive spin on the whole idea of multipolar world order, or we could really go back to a situation as we had it in the darkest periods of the original Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were the 2 superpowers, and basically everything anywhere else in the world was viewed through the lens of that particular conflict, and you had all these proxy wars and all the damage that they have done, lasting damage that they have done to countries and societies across what we now refer to as the global south. So that is still also a possible outcome of this current uncertainty, and that would then speak very well to the second proposition that you put forward there, that it becomes really difficult for these smaller powers to actually find a place where they can live in peace and prosperity.
Yeah, Professor, I would like to ask the same question about the frozen conflict, so-called de facto states in the post-Soviet space, as your academic research also covers these issues. So, specific question is, which is really interesting for me, how do you see, changes and continuities, you call it, in the frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space after Russia's, let's say, launch of war against Ukraine in February 2022? We have been mostly hearing about Nagorno-Karabakh, and now Azerbaijan restored its sovereignty over all the territory, but I think we don't hear about Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria. How do you see the war in general? Maybe the vacuum it created affect the situation in these territories.
Yeah, again, very interesting question, and not a straightforward answer that is possible here. I think if we start sort of the furthest west with the conflict in the Transnistrian region of Moldova, here I think that, that has been probably the most frozen conflict in a relatively positive sense. Since the ceasefire agreement there in 1992, 1993, after the initial conflict, there was one person that was killed at the boundary between the Transnistrian region and Moldova. There has been relative openness, freedom of movement, economic exchanges. All of that has developed in relatively stable and predictable ways over the past 30 years. The deep and comprehensive free trade area that Moldova has with the European Union has been extended to the Transnistrian region since 2016. So all of that in many ways points to the fact that nobody on either side of this particular conflict line has any interest in further escalation. And anything that we have seen there since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine since February 22, points to the fact that the overarching interest on both sides is stability. Now, Moldova has been a candidate country of the EU since June last year. Accession negotiations are likely to open soon. So again, from this perspective, I expect some progress in the long term, also in the sort of permanent settlement of this particular conflict, but I don't expect it to happen overnight. So we will not be waking up tomorrow or next week or even early next year and suddenly it's all a fully resolved conflict. But clearly this conflict, in my view, remains the one with the greatest prospect of a positive settlement. if we then move to the South Caucasus and look at Abkhazia and South Ossetia first, again, I mean, Georgia now most likely will be approved as a candidate country for EU membership following the reasonably positive report of the European Commission last week. But again, here I do not see any immediate prospects of a restoration of Georgia's territorial integrity. I mean, in many ways, here I think it is almost more likely that, if anything, we are going to see another Cyprus scenario in 10, 15, or 20 years, maybe, or eventually an acceptance that unless there is major regime change in Russia, these may not be territories that Georgia will be able to recover anytime soon. And that then finally leaves sort of the original so-called frozen conflicts, the one in Nagorno-Karabakh. And here I think, I mean, you've already said quite clearly that Azerbaijan now has restored its full territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that, I mean, certainly in terms of the international legal status of that territory, I think is right and proper. The question is how this process now will be managed, sort of from a human and humanitarian perspective. And I think that in many ways brings us back to the earlier discussion about you can't be selective in applying core principles of human rights and international humanitarian law. So from my perspective, the most important thing in relation to that particular situation is making sure that it is managed responsibly, that it is managed with a view, again, on the lives and livelihoods of the individual people that are involved there, and that in the end a solution is found that makes it possible for people in what is geographically relatively small region, both Nagorno-Karabakh as a whole, but also if you look at the South Caucasus as a whole, to make it possible for people to live together there side by side, regardless of their ethnic, religious, linguistic identities. And I think that places a responsibility on sort of, there's this idea of a 3+3 framework, so that places a responsibility on Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the people in Karabakh. But it also places a responsibility on the immediate neighbors, and here I'm thinking Russia, Turkey, and Iran, who all have different interests there. But also then there's the question of what the far neighbors are actually doing. So China is an increasingly important player in the South Caucasus in the context of the so-called Middle Corridor. The European Union has tried, so far not very successfully, to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so we have the, I mean, just as a matter of fact, I mean, the United States always has an interest in everything and everywhere. So that also will remain a player of significance. And I think, again, sort of the more these larger outside powers can manage their relationships well, the more likely will it be that sort of these more localized tensions and conflicts can be handled in a way that it doesn't become a humanitarian disaster.
Yeah, that was actually my last question, Professor Wolff. Thank you very much for your insightful comments, for your time, and we hope to see you again in our program soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.